My favorite thing to do is walk into a crowded room full of people where I don't know anybody, because it's like a rich field. It's an open white space for me to go and meet new people. Every transaction with another person it's a negotiation. You're going to come out of it as with a new friend, with new knowledge, with something, and hopefully you contribute.
I'm Sam Christensen, and this is All Things Negotiation. I'm super excited today to be joined by a good friend, Curtis Feeney. I've been anxious to talk to him because Curtis is literally the best person I have ever met in my life at forming and maintaining relationships. Quickly, his background, which is impressive. He went to Harvard Business School and then went to work at the Trammell Crow Corporation, which at the time was the largest real estate developer in the world. Rose up to be a managing partner there, left to work at Stanford and worked at the Stanford Management Company, which helps manage the endowment, and grew that tremendously. Went into venture capital and was a partner at Voyager Capital. And Curtis, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's where we met. You gave us some office space. I was doing a startup, and you were nice enough to be our landlord for a few years.
That's right. I remember it well. You were with Arbor at the time doing deals, and I was just getting started in a venture capital firm doing deals. So it was a great fit.
Yeah. Well, great to have you on the podcast. We're going to talk mostly, we could talk about your career, and we're not going to. We're going to talk about a very specific skill set that you have that I mentioned on relationship management, relationship building. One thing that you mentioned to me years ago, you probably don't remember, but that you really can get to know a person by understanding their life between the age of, say, 5 and 20. Who were the big influences on you in that period of your life, and what did you learn from them? Just to give us a quick intro.
Yeah, well, I think it's the way I think you really get to know somebody is what were they like in their formative years? Because then once you mature enough, you spend the rest of your life trying to cover up those flaws that you have that are so obvious in your formative years. So where did you grow up? Where did you go to grade school, high school? What sports did you play? How many siblings did you have? These are all things that shape you. And so with my particular case, and it came to me over time, I realized we had a large family, 6 children, 2 parents teaching school, but we moved a lot. We moved, you've heard me say this before, Stan, we moved 9 times by 9th grade with this ecosystem of a family that sort of made your social life was sort of carried with you in small part. And then you'd go to these new towns and you had to figure out, what do I do now? I've start over every year or two. And it teaches you a couple things. One, how to make friends fast, how to get involved fast, how to let go of things. I just left what I had just gotten comfortable with. Now I have to move on. I'm not going back there. So it's sort of one of my close friends, Dan Francis, he always says, you have no regrets. And I think that's not something I consciously decided to have no regrets. It's just what you had to do to move around a lot. I call it the Army brat syndrome. We all know people that were in the military, they moved every year or two, and you're either bitter or better. And I think a lot of people come out of it better because they just learn how to let go of things and move in, get to know people quickly, and keep going forward.
So let's fast forward to your adult professional life. I've always been a little skeptical of, quote, networkers, people that are always trying to have the people they know be their main currency. And you've never struck me as a classic networker. You're actually a relationship builder. And I think you're pretty deliberate. We've had conversations over the years about some of the things you've done to do that. And so to the extent that you have either frameworks in your head, processes in your head for how you build relationships, gain relationships, keep the relationships, and build them, are there thoughts that come to mind there?
I think people who work with sort of a formula for networking almost try too hard and try to prioritize it. I look at almost every person as being someone I want to know. Someone, whether they're the CEO or the janitor. So I like to know the people. What did they do? Are they interesting? Do they have something fun about them that I want to share? And I also categorize most people by where they were when they did whatever. So you went to Harvard Law back in the 80s, and so I know where you were then, and so I'll know other people that were there when you were or whatever. So part of the fun of traveling around a lot and meeting a lot of different people is I like to say it's a small world if you pay attention. The next person you meet may well know someone that you knew. And it's just a matter of opening up. I was in Whitefish, Montana. A guy at the Best Buy had on a pair of suspenders that said Katy, Texas, Katy High School. I lived in Katy when I was 6. My dad was the math teacher at the local high school. I said, "Oh, Katy, is that Katy, Texas?" Because he's in Montana. "Yeah, well, my dad taught math at Katy." "Oh, really? What was his name?" "James K. Feeny." That was my math teacher. So the fact that I sort of took this total stranger and started talking to him about something that might have a connection. And next thing you know, he's sending me and my brothers and sisters photos of our dad from his yearbook. And that is just the same to me as meeting Chuck Feeny, who became a friend of mine, the founder of Duty Free Stores in General Atlantic. That meeting that guy at Best Buy is almost the exact same thing of how I met Chuck Feeny and became friends with him.
Tell us a little bit about that. Tell us, you've told me that story, but I think it's interesting how you met Chuck Feeny and how you developed that relationship.
Well, it came about because I had read his book called The Billionaire Who Wasn't. He made $8.6 billion and gave it all away, 100%. Didn't own a house or a car and just traveled the world giving away his money. And I thought, well, this is the person that we should all aspire to be. Not someone who's all about themselves, but someone who was very good at what they did and then shared it with others. So I read that book, and then I'm at a dinner and somebody says, well, let's all talk about if you could meet anybody. Who would you want to meet, past, present, future? And I said, well, I want to meet this guy, Chuck Feeny. And within a few months of that, I happened to be in New York. The Wall Street Journal had a full-page ad that the Cornell School was honoring Chuck Feeny at the Natural History Museum. I paid up. I bought a ticket. I bought 3 of his books that were basically a biography about him. And I went to see Chuck Feeny at this, I'm going to say 750 to 1,000 Cornell grads and me. And I went down and found him, and I got him to autograph my books, and we had a nice chat, and that eventually led to me becoming friends with him and having lunch with him once a quarter the last few years of his life.
So you just went, let me make sure I understand that. You just went in cold, you weren't necessarily going to go to that Cornell event, but bought a ticket, went and said, hey, I like your book. Will you sign these books for me? And stayed in touch, and that worked.
Well, and there was a little more to it. First of all, my seat was the very worst seat in the place because I bought it at the last minute. So I'm so far away. I had to go down and find him before the event started. Turns out, when you have a big networking event for a university, they're all there not to hear the speaker or the honoree. They're there to drink and socialize. So I captivated him for about half an hour. And I do have the same last name, which was kind of cute. So his name is Feeny, and my name is Feeny. And the first thing he said to me, he sees my name tag, and he says, I always wanted to meet the Feeny who couldn't afford the third E. And so he was charismatic, and we hit it off. But what happened next, this is another one of those little relationship things. There's a guy named Wally Bortz, who's the head of gerontology at Stanford. And he wrote an article in the local paper that he referenced Chuck Feeny. So I cut that article out. I sent him a note. I do this. I made the note look like a Hallmark card, and it had Wally Bortz's article in it. And I said, hey, Wally, Chuck Feeny is my hero. And Wally then calls me. He just starts mercilessly calling me. And he says, Curtis, Chuck Feeny is my best friend. You want to go meet him again? So we went up and had lunch, and that just led to me having lunch with him every quarter.
Wow. It
was a 2-step.
So you got those 3 books signed. I think I remember you telling me the story of what you did with those other 2 signed books.
Well, the title of the book is The Billionaire Who Wasn't. So I said, Chuck, I have 3 billionaire friends. I want you to sign this book for them. And so one was to John Doerr, one of the top guys at Kleiner Perkins. One was for Tom Siebel of Siebel Software, and now C3I. And then the third one was for Scott Cook, who founded Intuit. And they were all Woodside neighbors, and our kids had grown up together. So I had a relationship with those guys. And so he did. He signed the books for them and made very nice notes to them personally, and I hand-delivered each one. It was so that in that way, it was sort of continuing those kind of relationship touch points where if everybody sends out Christmas cards or New Year's cards or whatever, I like to send out little notes off sync, out of the mainstream, so that it's a little personal note. I think I told you the one about Craig Johnson. I sent a note to Craig Johnson where he was this is the founder of J&P Securities. and he was in the San Francisco Chronicle with a picture of him in his office, and behind him was the Transamerica Pyramid in the background. And his head was actually appeared to be larger than the Transamerica Pyramid. So I made a note out of it. I said, Craig, you're bigger than San Francisco's biggest icon. And I had a little hash mark showing that his head was bigger than the Transamerica. And I know he kept that on his desk because he thought that was cute. But those little things, if I send something to you, Stan, and it's about you, then you're going to appreciate me because I've appreciated you, right?
Yeah, super smart. I mean, everybody likes people to notice. It doesn't matter if you're wealthy, poor, successful, unsuccessful. And the fact that you both do that off cycle, which I think is interesting, and just let them know you're reading, you're listening. You and I have talked a bunch over the years about your collection of signed books and sharing those, and sharing that passion with other people is a great relationship building skill. Another thing that you've done over the years that I've observed, a lot of people that are really networked and have great relationships hold those close to the vest. And you're a good introducer. I assume I'm not the only person you do that for, but you've been very generous with me over the years of introducing me to people, and not just kind of second, third tier contacts. You've introduced me to some of your very best people, or people that I would think of as anyone's best people. So talk about that. Talk about introductions and how do you decide to introduce, and is that part of your strategy?
Well, first of all, I do think good people should know each other. So if I meet two people that have the same love of a sport or love of an activity or a career direction, I'm always interested in them getting to know each other. I think if you really like people, you want your friends and people to be friends with each other. So I always think of it that way.
I love that. One thing you mentioned to me once is that you're not afraid to go out and proactively seek meeting your idols. And Sal Khan, I think, was one of your idols. So how in the world did you meet him initially?
Well, it was another book signing thing. Ann Dorr was a neighbor. This is John's wife, and she's the founding board member of Khan Academy. And she hosted Sal's first book for a book signing in Woodside. So I really thought I bought the book, I read it. This is the best thing I've seen on education. I grew up poor in El Paso. My parents were educators on the wrong side of the tracks. So my wife and I both have supported low-income education as one of our main things. And so I took 5 copies of his new book and got Sal to sign them for my daughter, who's a teacher, my brother-in-law, who was on the board of a boarding school back east. And then I figured the new head of the boarding school at Andover, where my kids were going to school, would be a guy that should meet Sal and should hear about his book. So I got him to sign one for a guy named John Palfrey, who was the youngest tenured prof at Harvard Law and had come over for some reason to be the head of school at Andover. And he was starting the same year as my last child to go to Andover was starting his first year. So I fly back to Andover with that book and give it to Palfrey. And this is 2010. He's never heard of Khan Academy. He's never heard of The One World Schoolhouse, great book. So I give it to him and I said, John, you got to read this book. This is where education's going. And then I follow up, and I eventually, within a few weeks of that, introduce him to Sal. And then he starts sending the AB and BC calculus teachers from Andover to Khan Academy to help them on their curriculum. Now, Sal Khan, like a lot of these successful people, is extremely busy. So I didn't want to introduce him to someone that wasn't going to be efficient for him to know in a productive way. So I did that 2 or 3 more times. I introduced him to one of the founders of the Chasm Group, Crossing the Chasm for marketing strategy. Introduced him to Ron Johnson, who was the head of Apple's retail rollout, to talk about retail. A guy named Eric Van Dillen, who ran half of IMG, and to talk to Sal about corporate sponsorships and so on. So after 4 or 5 of those intros, Sal asked me to join his advisory board and then eventually his big board.
You and I got to know each other in Silicon Valley, and one of the things that is lamentable, or I should say I lament about Silicon Valley, is people tend to measure success by what they do and how much money they have. And again, I think you've got a different approach. So maybe just share with listeners a little bit about how you prioritize things and where career versus money versus your time, how that all fits for you.
Yeah, and I think growing up in a larger family dynamic, it makes you realize you can't have selfishness in that dynamic. You can't have it's all about me. You have to create a team dynamic. So I raise my kids basically with the theory that you're not going to be successful if you pursue money as your goal. And money's a good currency, but it's not the best currency because it's all about what do I have? And it's egocentric and materialistic. And you will make life mistakes if it's all about what do I have? Time is a better currency. And what I do is more important than what I have. In fact, I try to tell my kids, spend your money on experiences, not on things. But time is also egocentric. It's what do I do? So I try to teach the kids the best currency in life, and this is back to, since this is a negotiation podcast, negotiating with other people. Every transaction with another person it's a negotiation. You're going to come out of it as with a new friend, with new knowledge, with something, and hopefully you contribute. You become a friend. You give someone some new knowledge. So if you think of life as a series of negotiations or transactions between people, and you try to balance those people negotiations in a fair way, I think the best negotiations are the ones that are fair for both sides, or balanced, equal for both sides. So the best currency is people, not time, not money. And when you think of it that way, I think it eliminates a lot of mistakes humans make when they're doing something all for themselves. If everything's part of a community. If you're adding to the community and balancing it, everybody wins.
Yeah, you and I see that the same way. We both went to Harvard Business School, and they certainly, when I was there, were not teaching that in Harvard Business School. It was much more transactional, as opposed to, I don't think there was a class at Harvard titled How to Build Relationships Over Time. If so, you should have taught it. But that just wasn't what they were teaching. Why do you think that is? Why do people not understand that negotiation is a long-term game done in the context of ongoing relationships? Do you have any diagnosis for why people, because it seems intuitive and obvious as you say that, but why, what's your perspective on why people don't get that?
I think most human nature is to be siloed. Human nature is to work in your backyard, in your territory, and that's very natural. And I think the people who have the broadest view of their community and think of everybody as much as they can tend to be the ones that everybody wants to follow, right? The leaders that people will get behind. So I think it's not that natural to have win-win negotiating and to do something that's best for everybody. I think in corporate America, for example, most corporations are set up to build basically value for their shareholders. And the theory is that everybody benefits. But the fact is, shareholders are not the only constituents in an ecosystem. It's the employees, it's the community, it's the customers, and the shareholders, the management team as well. So you've got to, if you take the longer view, this is where I think you can actually break through. If you take a longer view and say, this transaction that I'm doing is one of many that are going to happen, then you can start to say, okay, well, then I want to optimize it, not for the short term, but for the long term. I always use the word optimize instead of maximize, because maximization is short-term win-lose. Optimization, you can stretch it out over time, and then over time, you get your payback.
Yeah, and as you say that, what it makes me think of is the only way to optimize is to be in an ongoing relationship, right? There's not a static optimization. And I'm certainly focused on that, of teaching people that you're going to see people over and over and over again. So how you treat them, not just for moral purposes, you should treat them well, but for self-interest, right? Because
and they become your best references. If you're only going to do one deal one time and never see that person or that event again, maybe that is the right way. And of course, that's kind of how they teach in business school. But the fact is, most of us are going to be seeing a lot of the same people over and over again. And then somebody that you're nice to and did something for, maybe didn't even cost you, later on, they send you something back. Hey, I've got this person treated me well. Why don't you talk to them? And that could lead to something that you would have never imagined.
How do you sort of keep in touch with people's stuff? Some people just list people's birthdays and reach out, and that always feels to me a little hollow. But if it's more substantive and they really know what's going on with you or your family, I think that's more persuasive.
I think one of my advantages in my younger days, because of all that ecosystem I grew up in, I was really good with names. And the guy who founded Chick-fil-A, a guy named Truett Cathy, I met him once at a Chamber of Commerce deal, and he had this great line. He said, if you can just remember people's names, it's worth an MBA. And so I was very good at that in my younger days. I have to say, we're all getting older. I'm not as good as I used to be at it.
By definition, obviously we're living in a time right now of division. You mentioned that part of that is people are in silos and they sort of don't transcend boundaries. And so what do you do to try to get perspectives from people that are not in the silos that you're in? Any strategies for that?
There's a couple of books I recommend on this subject. One, Sapiens. If you read the book Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, he talks about how civilization evolved and how humans behave the way they do. And I think a lot of it is just understanding. And then another book I like by Jeff Hawkins is called, his first book was called On Intelligence. His new book is called 1,000 Brains. But if you understand how civilization evolved and how humans think, how the brain is wired, you really start to understand any of us could be made to believe almost anything based on the trusted inputs we receive about religion, politics, you name it. And so since I believe that if I had your experiences, I would believe whatever you believe, because that's how the brain is wired. It's a pattern recognition, deep embedded memory engine. And once I started thinking that way, I stopped judging people based on their politics, religion, and strong-held values that they thought they believed. And I like to think of it as simply, are they a nice person? Hopefully interesting. I'm boring. I get tired of boring, but nice, interesting, successful at what they do. They try to do well at what they do. They treat people well. I don't care what they believe, because they didn't get to make that choice. They think they did, but they didn't get to choose what God they believe in, what religion or politics they believe in. That was over the years hardened into their heads through trusted inputs. So as long as they're nice people, I'm good with them.
I'm going to highlight three things you brought up because they're so good. Number one, in negotiation, you need to prepare, right? If you're prepared, you do better. And when I talk to people, even at the highest levels of government and business, and ask, how long did you prepare for that negotiation? The answer often comes back, well, depends if my partner and I were sitting next to each other on the airplane. We took a couple minutes. I remember interviewing former Secretary George Shultz, and at the highest levels, he was negotiating a SALT II treaty. And I asked him about the preparation, and it was surprisingly minimal, even at that level. So I think people chronically underprepare. So I'm glad you hit on that. Number two, putting yourself in their shoes. If we believe in the project of humanity, everyone deserves our empathy. And if you can really understand their perspective by putting yourself in their shoes and really doing a lot of inquiry as opposed to advocacy, we tend to be better advocates than we are inquirers. And that's very important. And the third thing that you alluded to is just not making assumptions about people based on their either behavior or beliefs, but having the view of what you can learn from them, I think is really powerful. So I'm glad you hit on all three of those things. One other thing I want to mention that you brought up is you're just a guy, in my experience, that likes people, right? You said, you qualified a little bit and said, well, I don't like boring people, but
or mean. I don't like mean people because they won't let me be their friends.
Well, one thing that you do, and I was just at your barbecue a couple of weeks ago, and you have this famous annual barbecue, and I was struck by the guest list there in the sense that it was very diverse, all kinds of different people, different ages, different backgrounds, different geographies. Has that been a good way to connect people over the years, your barbecue?
Well, the barbecue thing started in an odd way. First of all, it fits. You've heard me say this before. My favorite thing to do is walk into a crowded room full of people where I don't know anybody, because it's like a rich field. It's an open white space for me to go and meet new people. But the barbecue thing became a tradition for me because I have a multi-100 person barbecue every year where I cook on the grill and I do all the burgers myself. But I had first, my son was rowing crew at Stanford, and I think either he asked or maybe I asked him, let's invite the entire crew team over for barbecue. And so I think we had like men's and women's crew was 80 people, including coaches. So, but these people eat 5,000 calories a day. So it made me realize I fed 80 crew athletes, which was like feeding 250 normal people. And so I said, oh, so I could feed 250 people in the same barbecue. I had a big backyard. So we started doing it in business, and we invited young tech execs from all over Silicon Valley. And I had the summer interns every year. My summer intern, one of their projects was to get the invite list for all the MBAs and tech execs from Silicon Valley that they could find, from Harvard Business School, Cal, wherever, and get them all to come to this barbecue. So we did that for about 12 or 13 years. So when I moved to Park City, the most recent one I did was just continuing the same thing. I have the band already. I already have the barbecue grill, and I just invite. I think we had 200 people at the one you were just at, and maybe more.
Yeah, so it's such a gift to be able to congregate people and connect people, and I just really appreciate that about you. Another thing I've noticed about you over the years is you're kind of a yes man in a positive way. I feel like if I reach out to you, you're going to respond quickly. I feel like if I ask you to do something, you're going to say yes. And so talk about that. How do you filter? How do you decide what things to jump into with 1 foot or 2 feet? And that kind of optimistic energy that I find contagious in you.
Well, this other thing I tell my kids is if someone asks you this open-ended question, if someone ever asks you, will you do me a favor? The wrong answer is to say what? The right answer is to say, sure, I will do you a favor. Now, if they take advantage and ask you a favor that is 10x more output than is reasonable, then you can renegotiate. Then the negotiation begins. But the first answer is yes, I'll do you a favor. And maybe it's, maybe you're going to make an introduction, but you can do a lot of things quickly that people appreciate. And if you can do something quickly that someone else is going to appreciate, that doesn't cost you much, you do that 100% of the time. And then if it's a big ask and it doesn't make sense, then you have to negotiate to something else. So I do think one of my favorite quotes from Joan Rivers, who passed away recently, she said, she was asked, what's the secret to your success? And she said, I was always smart enough to go into every open door. And so saying yes to opportunities, whereas a lot of people want to overanalyze that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, let's drill down there. So you're in Houston, Trammell Crow headquarters, probably meeting all the top people, probably easiest way to the top of Trammell Crow is to stay in Texas, but you decide to go to Seattle. How did you start there, your networking, your relationships? I mean, did you know a lot of people when you went, or was that really starting from scratch? So how'd you build that network in Seattle?
Well, so one thing I learned when you go to a new place, you get involved in the activities of that new place. So when I was a kid, I would play all the sports, played every sport I could, did all the activities at the schools. So when you move into a new community and business, you want to jump into the new opportunities. It turns out one of the most interesting things about my Seattle experience, on the Oklahoma City side of the equation, I was a big fan of low-income education, as I said earlier, helping kids. So I had started donating time and money to the Boy Scouts in Oklahoma City, and I raised a bunch of money for the Oklahoma City Boy Scouts through my network of real estate development connections. So when I moved to Seattle, unbeknownst to me, the head of Oklahoma City Boy Scouts calls the head of Seattle Boy Scouts and says, you got to get this guy on your board. He's really good at helping out the kids. So I show up in Seattle, and the next thing you know, I'm on the board with Phil Condit, the CEO of Boeing, Jack Creighton, the CEO of Weyerhaeuser, Bill Gates Sr., who's Bill Gates' dad. It was the most powerful board in Seattle, and I had no idea. And why did it happen? Because I was so involved in Oklahoma City in things that they threw me into that one. And then, in fact, when Jack Creighton later met Trammell Crow, he said, Trammell, we don't know how Feeny did it, but he came up here and he got on the best board right away. Well, it had nothing to do with, I just said yes. I said, sure, I'll do it.
Fascinating. Trammell Crow is a sort of a famous business figure with a personality and a style. I never met him, but I certainly know him by reputation. What did you learn from either working with or observing his behavior in business?
Well, he was one of the most genuine, likable people. He loved people too. And he He was a workaholic, so I think I got a little of that from him. He liked to outwork everybody, but he liked to be nice to people. One of the fun stories, uh, the head of Equitable in Atlanta, one of the biggest lenders to real estate developers in the country, and the head of Equitable was telling me that Trammell would come into his office and he would take 20, 30 minutes to wind his way through the cubicles and through the corridors, saying hi to every secretary, every administrator, every executive, and he knew them all. Versus when Donald Trump would come in, he would have his entourage and carrying his things and go straight back, and he wouldn't acknowledge anybody. And that was just a difference in style and the difference in Trammell just treated everybody wonderfully. And he was as down to earth as I can imagine a billionaire being.
What that makes me think of is, often the index of someone's character is how they treat people with less power than them. I'm thinking right now of your assistant, April, who I've gotten to know over the years. I think you've had the same executive assistant for how many years have you had, April, working with you on the team?
Going on 24.
Okay, so you've had your executive assistant. So we should have her on the podcast and say, how does Curtis treat you? But the obvious answer is going to be, it's great, because otherwise she wouldn't have stayed all these years. Whenever I need to get to you, I know I need to go through April, and I hear back quickly. So talk a little bit about that relationship. That's 24 years. And because you're staying in touch with so many people, I'm sure she has a key role.
She's superb. But first of all, you don't have to go through April. But it's just more efficient because I'm usually in meetings. So if you call me, I'll pick up if you call me, but I'm probably in a meeting. So she can slot you in, and she knows if it's somebody I know, she knows what to do. And having worked with her for so many years, she was 19 when she first started working in our office at Voyager Capital, and now her family, she's got married and had kids, and we've sort of grown up together in the business. She's wicked smart, and she's so disciplined and so good and organized. So without her organizing all that for me, there's no way I could get done what I do.
You bring up responsiveness and her role helping you be responsive. A lesson I learned in my 30s, I was working on a transaction, and Michael Dell at the time was CEO of Dell Computers, and we'd had a meeting, and I had his email, and I was shocked that his email was michael@dell.com. And I would email him, and he would always get back within a couple of hours. And I remember thinking, how in the world am I important enough on all the things that he has to do that he can get back to me within 2 hours? So I asked him one day, I said, Michael, do you do your own email, or do you have an assistant do your email? And he said, nope, I just believe in responsiveness, and I just twice a day go through my inbox and just bang it all out. And ever since that experience, I've become more responsive, both the emails, texts, and phone calls, because if Michael Dell could do it, I figure I ought to be able to get back to people.
Of course, it doesn't hurt that he has a very high RPM brain. So,
Yeah.
So what would probably take me 5 minutes to do, he could probably do in 5 seconds. So he could probably be more responsive than the normal human.
Probably true. But I do find responsiveness to be a key to successful people.
Well, in fact, on that point, what I often like to do in a meeting, let's say I'm helping someone and it's either raising money or building their business, and I agree I'm going to make an introduction for an investor. So I will often, during the meeting, do a very brief intro and send it so that I don't even have it to do after the meeting. It's done. And I like doing that because once, your inbox can stack up by your own, inability to process things. So anything I can process in real time, I try to get it done.
I love that. It reminds me of a story. When I was at Harvard Business School, I came out to Silicon Valley and I met with an investor you might know of, Peter Wendell at Sierra Ventures. And I was telling him the kinds of things I was looking for. And while I was there, so this is the first time he had met me, while I was in his office, he made 3 phone calls and he just left voicemails. And he said something to the effect of, hey, I'm sitting here with Stan Christensen. I'm really impressed with him. He's a Harvard Business School student. I think you ought to meet with him and talk to him. And he banged it out right there in front of me and just got it done. So kind of an extreme example of what you're saying.
Well, and so Peter Wendell, he was best friends at Harvard Business School with Ro Moriarty. They played rugby together. I actually played rugby one year and overlapped with Ro at business school. So Roe, speaking of Peter Wendell, Roe Moriarty, I was going back to Boston with one of my kids at Andover, and I called up Roe and I said, "Hey, Roe, I'm going to be taking this new daughter of mine to Andover. I think she should meet your kids. Why don't we stay at your house and we'll go on over to Andover from there?" So I go to Roe's house and we have a wonderful dinner and we catch up. I was a partner at Trammell Crow and he was on the board of Trammell Crow. And he said, "Hey, Curtis, I'm thinking you might be a good fit for a board. Are you interested? Do you have capacity?" I said, "Sure. Let me know." That's how I ended up on the board of Trammell Crow, because I made the connection with Roe. If I have a good friend in an area, I'll literally say, "Hey, you going to be around? Want me to stay at your house?" I've done that. I did it with Joel Peterson of Peterson Partners. I've done it with people all over the country. And of course, when they come to Park City, I want them to stay at my house.
So good. I'm thinking to myself, is there anybody that I could bring up that I've met that Curtis doesn't have a contact with and a story about? You sort of seem to be connected to everybody. We're running out of time. What advice, just kind of closing thoughts? You and I are both middle-aged guys. This has been a great conversation. And I'm thinking, if I'm 20, which of these things are relevant based on the distractions I have? I mean, you sort of think of kids these days as being distracted from distractions by distractions. Obviously the role of screens, Jonathan Haidt's new book, highlighting the problems there. What specific advice would you have for people coming out of college now if they want to be effective at building relationships and having the kind of career that you've had, which, again, of all the people I've met in my life, you're the most successful at building relationships and maintaining them. Anything different these days that you'd sort of see or identify?
Well, of course, your footprint can be much bigger with digital. And what we found out during COVID was, instead of walking across the street to your neighbor's house, you would get on a Zoom call with somebody across the country. So I think the digital footprint does offer a bigger tent for all of us on our networking than we could have otherwise done. However, I think the thing I would encourage anyone to do is, you're in a local community, get involved in your local community and try to meet people do whatever people in your community are doing. Join the ski club if you're in Park City, join the Chamber of Commerce, join activities that will get you involved in your community, and then you will meet all kinds of people that are either in your business or not, but that are embedded in that community. And I think it's a great way to live your life, is being a big participant in your own local community. And then the rest goes out from there.
And I think that that's hard to do over Zoom, right? I mean, there are just things that the live in-person can't be substituted for. And I think it's a thing that lots of people our generation worry about of, if you're asynchronously interacting with someone through text or even a live Zoom meeting, there's just a big drop-off in the empathy, the relationality that you can have for them. And so I just think that's fantastic advice.
And by volunteering, when I joined the Boy Scout board in Oklahoma City, I didn't go and say, "Hey, I want to join your board." I said, "How can I help? I want to be a volunteer." And I just started volunteering. And that's sort of how I happened into Khan Academy and so on. And then once you start participating as a contributor, you get known as a contributor. I told one of my closest friends is a guy named Chad Hutchinson, who was a pro quarterback and a pro pitcher in the bigs. He's had a huge private equity career after that. And when he went back to finish his degree at Stanford after he came out of pro sports, he said, "Why should I finish the degree?" I said, "Chad, business is very simple. People want you to do what you say you're going to do and finish what you start. And if you just live your life with those two axioms and then try to exceed expectations along the way, things will fall in place for you."
That's a great place to start. Thank you so much for spending the hour with us. Thanks, Curtis.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to All Things Negotiation. You can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoyed the show, please consider giving us a rating and leaving a review, which helps others find the show. The show was produced by Benny Beausoleil. Original music by Peter Breinhold. Designed by Aubrey Benson. Thanks for listening.